to do, right? One is going to be active transport, and two is going to be bulk transport. So far, every single thing that we have learned falls under the category of passive transport, right? And the key to passive transport is that it does not require any what? Energy, right? No energy is required. And the material is moving from an area of high concentration down to an area of low concentration, or down its concentration gradient. We looked at multiple forms, right? We looked at simple diffusion. We said small, non-polar stuff can diffuse right through the cell membrane. Oxygen, carbon dioxide. We looked at non-polar things like fats, like steroid hormones. They diffuse directly through the membrane. We looked at osmosis and water potential, which are both the diffusion of water from high to low concentration. And then finally, the last thing that we talked about on Friday was facilitated diffusion, which again does not require any energy. It's still moving high to low, but now you have large polar things that are diffusing into or out of the cell through some type of transport protein, either a protein channel or a carrier protein. Things that are going to move in through facilitated diffusion are large polar things like sugar, like amino acids, right? These things enter the cell through facilitated diffusion, right, with the aid of a protein channel. So now we have to transition. And the opposite of passive transport is active transport. Active transport, number one, is going to require energy. And that energy is going to come in the form of what? ATP. All right, good. So active transport is powered through ATP. Active transport is going to do the opposite. It's going to move from low to high. Do you think it's easy to move from low to high? No, right? And that is why it requires the ATP. If we go back to our example that we drew, right, with passive transport, you had the boulder on the top of the mountain, right? And through its natural kinetic energy, the boulder is going to go down, high to low. But now with active transport, our boulder's on the bottom. And we're trying to move that boulder from low to high. And if you're pushing something from low to high, that requires energy. Requires energy in the form of ATP. Does that make sense to all of you? Now, the goal of a lot of active transport, you probably want to write this down. A lot of active transport, its goal is to actually create a gradient, right? Many times the goal of active transport is to actually create a concentration gradient. The best example of this in the body, the most important example of this in the body, is a really important pump called the sodium-potassium pump. And the sodium-potassium pump plays an absolutely vital role in the nervous system. Right? The nervous system would not work. Your nervous system would not be able to generate electricity without a pump called the sodium-potassium pump. Now let's all look at the board for a minute. Right? Now let's look at how this pump is working. right? Na, that's sodium. K plus, that's potassium. What this sodium-potassium pump does is that it uses energy in the form of ATP to pump sodiums out of the cell. And it's using energy in the form of ATP to then pump potassium into the cell. So if we look at that for a second, the sodium-potassium pump is simultaneously generating two gradients. It's pumping 3 sodium out, it's pumping 2 potassium in. So we're generating a gradient of sodium on the outside, and we're generating a gradient of potassium on the inside. Does that make sense to all of you? Now, sodium and potassium both have positive charges, right? But you're pumping 3 sodium out for every 2 potassium in. So where are there more positive charges actually going? Out of the cell or into the cell? Out. You actually have a lot more going out. And what that does is that it causes the outside of the cell to have the positive charge, and it causes the inside of a cell to have a negative charge. Does anybody know the name of the type of cell in the nervous system? What do we call those? It's part of that cell. It's called a neuron. All right, it's called a neuron. All right, so this is taking place inside of a neuron. We call it the sodium-potassium pump. It's using energy, right? I should draw that energy in there. It's using energy in the form of ATP. And you're pumping sodium out, you're pumping potassium in. Does that make sense to all of you? So Brock, if all the sodium is being pumped out, where does all that sodium want to diffuse? Back into the cell. Right, you got it. All the sodium is being pumped out, it wants to diffuse back in. Marcus, all the potassium is being pumped in, where does it all want to diffuse? Back out. Right? Does that make sense to all of you? And the nervous system uses this. Right? This nervous system uses this to create electricity. The sodium being pumped out and the potassium being pumped in creates a positive charge on the outside, creates a negative charge on the inside. We give this a name. We call it an electrochemical gradient. It's called an electrochemical gradient. It's found within the nervous system. Let's take that word and break it down for a second. Electro, we're talking about a difference in charge. And here's our difference in charge. You have the positive charge on the outside, you have the negative charge on the inside. And then chemical is referring to chemicals. This is your sodium, and this is your potassium. So the sodium-potassium pump is actually creating two gradients at the same time. It's creating a gradient in charge, where you have positive charge on the outside, negative charge on the inside, and you're also creating a chemical gradient. All the sodium has been pumped out, all the potassium has been pumped in. Right? Together we call this an electrochemical gradient. Good? All right. All right. It's found within the nervous system, It's called the sodium-potassium pump, and it is by far the #1 example of active transport in the body. Another great form of active transport that we see is something called a proton pump. And remember that a proton is the same thing as a hydrogen ion, an H+. So you can call this a hydrogen ion, you can call this a proton, they are the same thing. Now look at that picture on the board. Alright, let's see. Test, this question's for you. Does this proton pump in this example create an electrochemical gradient?
Yes.
Yes, it does. Does it create a gradient of chemicals? Yes. All the protons are out and nothing is in. Do we all see that? Cole, does it also create an electrical gradient?
Yes.
Yes, because you have a positive charge on the outside, you have a negative charge on the inside, right? And the reason why it creates this gradient of charge is because protons have what charge? Positive charge, right? So you're pumping all the positives out, which gives it a positive charge on the outside, and therefore gives it a negative charge on the inside. So a proton pump also creates an electrochemical gradient, a gradient of both charge and chemicals. I'm going to add something to this. So now, this is the last thing I want to get through today. I want to loop together active transport and passive transport. And when we loop them together, we call it co-transport. So, do me a favor, don't write for a second, just look up here. Alright? Here we see a proton pump, using energy in the form of ATP to pump protons out of the cell. Do you all see that? And you're building up a proton gradient. Where do all those protons want to diffuse? They want to diffuse back in, right? Down their gradient. Does that make sense? Now there's a protein channel that's special. We call this a co-transporter. The protons can diffuse back in through the co-transporter, but they can't go back through alone. They can only go through the co-transporter if they are accompanied by the other molecule that the co-transporter is designed for. In this example, it's the disaccharide sucrose. So when the protons are rushing back into the cell, it's going to pull sucrose into the cell along with it. So this coupling we call a co-transporter. And when you look at it, the protons are diffusing down their gradient. Do we all see that? But the protons diffusing down their gradient are pulling sucrose against its gradient. Do we all see that? So the protons going down their gradient, rushing into the cell, is actually being used to load sucrose into the plant cell. So the protons are going down their gradient, and that's pulling the sucrose up its gradient. And it's a way that plants use to load sugar into their cells. Does anybody know the name of the tubes inside of a plant that transport sugar? It's the phloem. The phloem, P-H-L-O-E-M, phloem transport sugar. And this is the method that a plant uses to load all of its sugar into its phloem. Once the sugar is in the phloem, where is a plant going to send all of that sugar? We talked about it on Friday. Where do plants store their sugars? In their roots. Good job today, everybody. Have a great day.